Los Angeles, California saw mass protests this June as people flooded the streets in protest of the US government's abuse of immigrants. And the Donald Trump administration responded with very heavy repression. Trump ordered the military to be sent to Los Angeles. He sent 700 Marines and 2,000 members of the National Guard. This has caused a political crisis in the US because California's local government is accusing Trump and the federal government of violating the Constitution. The governor of California filed a lawsuit and a request to block Trump and the US Department of Defense, accusing them of illegal militarization of Los Angeles and condemning their takeover of a California National Guard unit, which the governor of California says is illegal. The response of the Trump administration has been extremely aggressive. Police and military officers have been shooting protesters and even journalists. In fact, there was a diplomatic scandal after a militarized LA police officer shot an Australian journalist while she was transmitting live on TV. And this led Australia's Prime Minister, Albanese, to criticize the US government for violently repressing not only protesters, but journalists reporting on these protests. Many other journalists in LA also reported being shot at by the authorities. This was not just an isolated incident. This is an intentional tactic being used by US authorities. What this demonstrates is how the very aggressive policies pursued by the US empire around the world in the wars that it's constantly waging in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen, Syria, Libya, and beyond, those aggressive policies eventually come home. Those repressive tactics are used against people in the United States. And you can see this very clearly in the militarization of US police forces. It's common for US police departments to have armored vehicles and heavy military equipment. And this military-grade technology comes from the Pentagon. In fact, what's very striking is you can make a chart that looks at the number of US soldiers who were occupying Iraq illegally in a war of aggression. And when the majority of those soldiers came home, there was a massive increase in the military equipment that the Pentagon gave to US police departments. So the soldiers came back to the US and militarized the country. And of course, the military-industrial complex has profited as US police forces have been militarized. And it's also private prison companies that have massively profited from these repressive US government policies. In fact, immediately after Trump won the presidential election in November 2024, the stock of major for-profit prison companies in the US skyrocketed. A good example of this is Geo Group. In September 2024, Geo Group stock was around $12 US. And by January 2025, the week of Trump's inauguration, its stock was $33, more than doubling, because these private prison companies knew that they would profit from the very repressive policies of Trump. Now, Trump is using very extreme rhetoric, and it sounds like he's waging a war against his own country. Trump referred to the protesters in Los Angeles as a national security risk, which shows how the US empire that has waged war around the world, those tactics that it uses abroad always eventually come home. Trump referred to the protests as a supposed example of, quote, invasion and third world lawlessness, end quote. And he, in particular, criticized protesters for using the flags of foreign countries, especially Mexico and Central American countries like Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala, because there are millions of people in the United States who are originally from those countries, although many have citizenship and have legal residency in the US, and it's not a crime to wave the flag of another country. Donald Trump should know that because he regularly appears at events with the Israeli flag, and he proudly referred to himself as the greatest friend of Israel ever in US history. And I should point out that it's very common for US politicians to put the Israeli flag in their office, in their congressional office in Washington, especially Republicans and right-wing politicians who are allied with Trump. So their issue is not really with foreign flags. It's actually with the flags of certain countries that the US empire doesn't like. Like, for instance, Palestine. If you wave a Palestinian flag, the Trump administration may arrest you and deport you. Trump has boasted that he's doing everything he can to try to deport pro-Palestine protesters. And Marco Rubio, who's probably the most powerful person in the Trump administration after Trump himself, Rubio is simultaneously serving as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. And Rubio boasted that the State Department canceled the visas of more than 300 people because they expressed support for Palestine and criticized Israel. So the message from the Trump administration is very clear. If you protest against the US-sponsored Israeli war on Gaza, then you will be arrested and deported. If you have a legal visa and legal residency, it will be canceled by the US government. In fact, the Trump administration arrested a Palestinian graduate student at Columbia University, Mahmoud Khalil, who had legal residency and a green card in the United States, permanent legal residency. He's not an undocumented immigrant, and the Trump administration is doing everything it can to try to deport Mahmoud Khalil. And why? Marco Rubio said it's because of his political views, because he opposes Israel's horrific US-sponsored crimes against his people, the Palestinian people. Moreover, the US agency that oversees deportations, which is called ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE arrested Mahmoud Khalil without a warrant, which was blatantly illegal in a violation of his civil rights. So all this demonstrates why there have been large protests in Los Angeles and other major cities across the United States condemning ICE for acting lawlessly. The Trump administration is blatantly violating many laws and trying to do everything it can to make the lives of immigrants in the US hell. And this includes not only undocumented immigrants, but also immigrants who have followed every single US law. There are so many cases now of legal residents in the US who have been arrested and even deported by ICE. There was a horrific case in May in which a father of 4 US citizens was detained by ICE at his citizenship interview after he lived in the US for 12 years. He was following all immigration law and was going through the process to become a citizen, and the Trump administration sent ICE agents to arrest him and try to deport him because they are so desperate to deport as many people as possible. This is why they are arresting immigrants who are going through all of the legal procedures, and they are arresting them at their official ICE check-ins. When they show up for the appointment with ICE, ICE arrests them. And Trump falsely claims that he's arresting criminals, but the majority of these immigrants do not have a criminal record, and that's why ICE is going after students. They are arresting high school students. In May, ICE agents even arrested a 9-year-old elementary school student in California, and they're going to deport this 9-year-old to Honduras. In fact, the Wall Street Journal published a story that provides the shocking details of how, under Trump, ICE has basically been acting as a lawless gang that's going out and kidnapping people. And by the way, you should keep in mind that the Wall Street Journal is a conservative-leaning newspaper. This is not a left-wing newspaper. In fact, the Wall Street Journal is owned by News Corp, which is the right-wing media conglomerate of the billionaire oligarch Rupert Murdoch, which also owns Fox News, which is basically pro-Trump state media. So the Wall Street Journal is not a biased newspaper that is against Trump. And in this article, they explain how Trump's top aide, Stephen Miller, who's overseeing a lot of his anti-immigrant policy, Miller ordered ICE agents to just go out and arrest immigrants. They're not actually focusing on gang members and criminals. They're focusing on anyone they suspect who could potentially be an undocumented immigrant. So they're basically just racially profiling and going after Latinos. And this article recounts how Miller told ICE agents they didn't need to actually create a list of immigrants they suspected in being in the US illegally. Instead, Trump's top advisor, Stephen Miller, ordered ICE agents to go to Home Depot, where day laborers typically gather looking for jobs, or to go to 7-Eleven's convenience stores. So they're just going out and detaining random immigrants who are looking for work. This article explains how ICE is acting completely lawlessly. It noted that, quote, there are no written directives, but officers have been told to do what you need to do to make more arrests, end quote. And listen to this passage. It's crazy what ICE is doing. They're acting like a mafia, like criminals. Quote, federal agents make warrantless arrests, end quote. That's obviously illegal. It violates civil liberties. But continuing, quote, masked agents take people into custody without identifying themselves, end quote. So again, that's basically like kidnapping. Some random person shows up on the street in random clothes and they just throw you in a van. That's kidnapping. I'm continuing. I'm reading from the article. Quote, plainclothes agents in at least a dozen cities have arrested migrants who showed up to their court hearings. And across the US, people suspected of being in the country illegally are disappearing into the federal detention system without notice to families or lawyers, end quote. So this is why people are protesting. This is why they're referring to it as kidnappings. The US government is sending out agents with no warrants, with no uniform, with no badge, and they're just throwing people into vans and arresting them and throwing them into detention centers with no charges. And the article goes on and describes in shocking detail what ICE has been doing. Quote, at least 8 agents in tactical gear, shields, and rifles surrounded a home with guns raised to arrest a father with no criminal history. In Irvine, California, ICE agents drove a phalanx of military vehicles in the Orange County suburb to arrest a person, though not for illegal immigration. They were seeking a resident son who allegedly posted flyers alerting neighbors to the presence of ICE agents, end quote. So they're literally arresting people for posting flyers, not actually for violating the law or being a criminal. I mean, what we're talking about here is a police state. This is dystopian, what's going on, and this is why people are protesting. Moreover, ICE has been arresting and deporting immigrants in the US simply for having tattoos. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, got access to internal ICE documents that show that ICE is using photos from Google Images of random tattoos like a star or a crown, or even a tattoo of Michael Jordan with the number of his jersey. And ICE is claiming that if you're an immigrant with a Michael Jordan tattoo or a star tattoo or a crown tattoo, you supposedly are a gang member, and ICE is arresting and deporting these immigrants, and in some cases sending them to a prison in El Salvador without trial. These are people who have not been convicted of a crime, and yet they're being sent to a prison in a foreign country and locked away without trial. This is why there have been big protests in Los Angeles and in other cities around the United States. Not only immigrants, but citizens are participating in these protests and saying that they're not going to tolerate the dehumanization of millions of people in the US by the government. In fact, if you look at Trump's budget, it makes it very clear that he is significantly expanding the militarization of the United States. And this is bipartisan. This also happened under Democrats like Barack Obama and Joe Biden. But Trump is taking it to a whole new level. He has boasted that he's expanding the US military budget to over $1 trillion US dollars. And he's also massively expanding the budget of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, which is notorious for its authoritarian repression of people in the US, spying on Americans, repressing people. And Trump is massively expanding the budget of the DHS from $65 billion to $107 billion. That is an increase of 65% in 1 year. And a lot of that money is going to ICE, US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which falls under DHS. And Trump is boasting that he's giving ICE free rein to be extremely violent with immigrants, to turn their lives into hell, to make them afraid to go out in public. And this is part of Trump's strategy to scapegoat immigrants for problems that were actually caused by billionaire oligarchs like Trump and his allies. There are 13 billionaires in Trump's administration, and the billionaire Trump has surrounded himself with some of the richest oligarchs in the world. He invited them to his inauguration, like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos. It is these oligarchs and big corporations that barely pay any taxes that are responsible for causing many of the problems domestically in the US. But what Trump does is he scapegoats immigrants. He blames some of the poorest, most marginalized people in US society, while Trump is cutting taxes on the richest Americans. It is a class war. He's doing everything he can to help the richest people in the country while doing everything he can to make the lives of the poorest people into absolute hell. And to try to deceive people into supporting his repressive policies, Trump claims that supposedly he's cracking down on immigrants to help working class Americans. And he claims that immigrants are taking the jobs of hardworking Americans. But in reality, the unemployment rate in the United States is extremely low. It's the lowest it's been in decades. It's around 4%. There was very high unemployment back in 2009 when it hit 10%, and that was because of the financial crisis that was caused by Wall Street and many of the billionaire oligarchs who are in Trump's administration and who are benefiting from his policies and his tax breaks on the rich and on big corporations. So again, it's not immigrants that are responsible for the economic problems in the US. In fact, we saw a clear example of this during the pandemic in 2020, when it became obvious that immigrants make up a huge share of the workers in essential sectors in the US economy, especially in agriculture, where nearly 1/4 of workers in the US are immigrants. They are literally feeding the US population, and 28% of construction workers in the US are immigrants. The more immigrants Trump deports, the more of a shortage of workers there will be in the construction and agriculture sector and many other sectors. In fact, as there's a shortage of construction workers, it will lead to fewer houses being built, which could likely lead to a further increase in the already unaffordable cost of housing in the US. Moreover, Trump scapegoats immigrants, and he falsely claims that they're taking away resources from the US government. But in reality, immigrants pay a lot of taxes, more than billionaires and the richest 1% of Americans whose taxes Trump is continuing to cut. In fact, even undocumented immigrants in the US who do not receive benefits from the government and Social Security and healthcare, even undocumented immigrants pay nearly $100 billion in taxes every single year, including more than $30 billion in federal social insurance taxes, despite the fact that, again, undocumented immigrants do not benefit from those programs that they're helping to fund. And by the way, research has consistently shown that immigrants in the US actually commit fewer crimes than native-born US citizens. Now, that doesn't mean that immigrants don't commit crimes, but what it does mean is that US citizens commit crimes at a higher rate than immigrants. And yet Trump is absurdly scapegoating immigrants and trying to scare people in the US to fear immigrants, despite all of the evidence showing that immigrants commit fewer crimes. So the reason I wanted to go over all those facts is that I wanted to provide important context for what has been going on in the United States with these protests in Los Angeles and other cities, these protests against the brutal repression. And this demonstrates the incredible hypocrisy of the US government, which is constantly condemning foreign governments, like for instance China, and claiming that supposedly they abuse protesters. Don't forget that back in 2019 and 2020, there were large violent riots in Hong Kong that were strongly supported by the US government. And these violent rioters in Hong Kong were waving US flags. And they had banners that said, President Trump, let's make Hong Kong great again. They called on Trump to militarily intervene in Hong Kong, in China, in order to, quote, liberate Hong Kong. And the US government strongly supported these violent riots in Hong Kong. And yet now Trump is violently repressing protests in the United States and sending the military and the National Guard to California in violation of the will of the local elected government in California in order to violently repress these protests that are going on. And Trump is criticizing protesters for waving the flag of Mexico or Honduras or Guatemala, whereas the first Trump administration was cheering on the violent riots in Hong Kong and giving them material support. The US government, through the National Endowment for Democracy, was funding some of the anti-China protest leaders in Hong Kong. Once again, this demonstrates the extreme imperial hypocrisy of the US, which has organized coups and color revolutions and violent protests and riots around the world, especially in Latin America, in places like Venezuela during a coup attempt in 2019, in Nicaragua in a US-backed coup attempt in 2018, or in Bolivia in a successful US-backed coup in 2019. The US is constantly destabilizing these countries. The US backed a military coup in Honduras in 2009, in which right-wing oligarchs used the military to overthrow a democratically elected left-wing leader. And this destabilized Honduras and turned it into one of the most violent countries on earth, which caused a mass wave of immigration from Honduras to the United States. And then Trump scapegoated those immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers and blamed them, scapegoated them for domestic problems in the US, not mentioning the role of the US government in destabilizing Honduras, in destabilizing Guatemala, in fueling violence in Mexico. US government officials have admitted that basically all of the gun violence in Mexico is committed with guns that were trafficked from the United States. Mexico does not sell guns. There is only one gun store in all of Mexico, which is a military store, and it's almost impossible to buy guns there. Nearly all of the guns in Mexico come from US gun corporations. And the Mexican government has long criticized the US arms industry and demanded that the US government investigate why so many cartels in Mexico have military-grade equipment from the United States. This military equipment is not coming from Mexico. It's coming from across the border, from the US. But again, instead of dealing with the root causes of these problems, Trump wants to simplistically scapegoat immigrants and say that immigrants are responsible for all the problems in the US, not the oligarchs and big corporations whose interests Trump is serving as himself a billionaire who has 13 billionaires in his administration. So the reason I wanted to go over all those facts is that I wanted to provide important context for what has been going on in the United States with these protests in Los Angeles and other cities. Now, I should be clear, this is not just Donald Trump. This did not all start under Donald Trump. There were mass deportations under Barack Obama and Joe Biden. ICE has continued to carry out these atrocities despite who the president is. But there is a difference in that Trump has completely given ICE free rein, and not only has he allowed these atrocities to be committed, he is encouraging US authorities to carry out these atrocities and to use violence and to brutalize immigrants and protesters. The cruelty is the point. And this demonstrates the true face of the US empire. What always happens with every empire is the repressive, violent tactics it uses in other countries, in the wars it wages around the world. Those tactics always come home. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the United States. The brutality committed by the US empire abroad has come home. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.